At dawn, frost clung to pine needles along a quiet county road as deputies approached a parked sedan left overnight. Inside, nothing screamed violence, yet everything felt wrong. The stillness, the condensation on glass, the unanswered phone vibrating once, then dying, marked the beginning of a long reckoning. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. North Carolina in December of 2006 carried its familiar contradictions. Mild afternoons, brittle mornings, church marquees switching from Thanksgiving messages to Christmas hymns, and local papers shrinking as the year closed. In Johnston County, the discovery set a careful machine into motion. The woman was 22 years old. Her name was Emily Renae Harper. She had been reported missing 2 days earlier by her mother after failing to come home from a late shift at a retail plaza outside Clayton. Emily was a community college student, balancing classes, work, and plans that felt practical and ordinary. She lived close to family, drove an aging sedan, and kept a predictable routine that made her sudden absence noticeable. The initial scene revealed no obvious trauma. Deputies documented the car's position, the keys on the floorboard, the radio preset to a local station cycling Christmas music. There were receipts on the passenger seat dated the prior evening. Emily's purse was not present. The air inside the vehicle was cool, suggesting the engine had not been running long before it was abandoned. Tire impressions nearby were photographed and cast, standard procedure even when they seemed generic. The area was canvassed with restraint, mindful of contaminating what little evidence existed. An autopsy would later confirm that Emily had died hours before the car was found, the cause consistent with asphyxia without visible injury. The findings were clinical and restrained, providing timing and mechanism without spectacle. Investigators noted the absence of defensive wounds and the lack of forced entry to the vehicle. The implication was quiet compliance, something that troubled those assigned to the case. Emily's phone records showed a final outgoing call shortly after she left work. It rang unanswered. The days before Christmas compressed the timeline. Missing person flyers went up at gas stations and grocery stores. The local press ran brief updates, careful not to speculate. Detectives reconstructed Emily's final movements through transaction logs and store cameras. She had clocked out, spoken briefly with coworkers, and walked to her car under functioning lights. No one reported a disturbance. A nearby camera captured her sedan exiting the lot at 9:41 p.m., turning toward a two-lane road that threaded through mixed farmland and subdivisions. Interviews followed a methodical pattern. Family members provided context without conflict. Emily had no known enemies, no recent breakups, no debts. Friends described her as cautious. Coworkers confirmed routine. Investigators collected clothing from her apartment for fiber comparison and documented her computer history, which showed holiday shopping and exam schedules. The evidence suggested interruption rather than planning. Winter slowed the work. Holidays reduced staffing and tips surged then faded. One report described a dark pickup scene near the plaza. Another mentioned a man asking for directions. Each lead was logged, assessed, and when unsupported, set aside. The case remained open, active, but thin. In January, detectives expanded their review to known offenders in the area with prior assault histories. None matched the emerging pattern. By spring, the case entered a quieter phase. Evidence was preserved. The sedan was released after processing. Emily's family held a memorial that emphasized dignity and patience. The courthouse files grew thicker with summaries rather than breakthroughs. Investigators requested assistance from the State Bureau of Investigation to review the timeline and physical evidence, including the tire casts and trace materials recovered from the car. Years passed with incremental progress. Technology improved. In 2012, the SBI re-examined fibers using updated methods, identifying a synthetic blend uncommon in typical clothing but consistent with certain work uniforms. The finding did not point to a person, only a possibility. In 2014, cell tower analysis refined the phone's final location, narrowing the corridor where Emily's last call originated. The area included a cluster of warehouses off a service road used by late-night drivers avoiding traffic lights. A break came quietly in 2018 when a retired detective revisited an overlooked report. A tow operator had logged a disabled pickup near the service road on the night Emily disappeared. The driver was a local man, 35 at the time, named Thomas Wade Collins, employed by a subcontractor servicing the warehouses. His vehicle description aligned with early tips. Collins had been interviewed once in 2007 and dismissed after providing a time card. The time card, it turned out, had never been independently verified. Investigators reopened Collins's background. Employment records showed inconsistencies. His alibi relied on a supervisor who had since died. Collins had moved counties, accumulated minor charges, and avoided attention. A court order obtained his DNA from a discarded item. When compared against trace material preserved from Emily's clothing, the match was partial but compelling. Additional analysis strengthened the link. In late 2019, detectives executed search warrants on Collins's former residence and storage unit. They recovered a jacket with fibers matching those identified years earlier. Phone records placed Collins's device near the service road during the critical window. Confronted with the evidence in a controlled interview, Collins offered shifting explanations that failed under verification. The arrest came in early December, 13 years after Emily's death, as Christmas lights returned to the courthouse square. The charge was second-degree murder. The legal process moved deliberately. Prosecutors presented the timeline, the forensic findings, the corroborated records. The defense challenged gaps created by time, but the evidence held. In 2021, Collins pleaded guilty, sparing the family a trial. He was sentenced to life with the possibility of parole after decades. The outcome was reported in measured headlines. There were no celebrations, only acknowledgments. Emily Harper's name was spoken again in public records with finality. The aftermath settled into routine. Evidence returned to storage. Files closed. Emily's mother placed a wreath at the roadside each December, a quiet ritual. The community absorbed the lesson that patience and procedure can outlast years. The case ended not with noise but with order restored and a town allowed to move forward. Winter returned again and again, while the case remained officially open, its file number unchanged even as calendars turned. Investigators documented each season because time itself became a factor worth recording. December weather reports were clipped and added to the folder, noting temperatures and road conditions that might have influenced travel patterns that night in 2006. The accumulation of routine details reflected a philosophy common among experienced detectives. Patience could preserve clarity when memory failed. Emily Harper's personal history continued to be refined long after the initial interviews. Bank statements confirmed modest spending, tuition payments, and grocery purchases that reinforced the absence of hidden stressors. Her email account showed reminders about final exams and a plan to attend a Christmas Eve service with family. There was no evidence of travel planning, no secret correspondence, and no sign of intent to leave voluntarily. Each negative finding strengthened the conclusion that her death resulted from an unexpected encounter rather than a prolonged dispute. The Sedan remained a focal point. In 2009, a A second forensic review revisited the vehicle's interior using improved lighting and collection techniques. Trace particles were cataloged again, not because new material was expected, but because documentation standards had evolved. A small cluster of fibers recovered from the rear seat seam was preserved separately, their origin unknown but distinctive. The care taken reflected an understanding that future technology might reframe old evidence. Media attention waxed and waned with anniversaries. Local newspapers published brief summaries each December, often alongside reminders about winter safety and holiday traffic. The tone was restrained, reflecting community familiarity with the case and respect for the family's privacy. Radio segments occasionally revisited the timeline, emphasizing the unresolved nature of the investigation without speculation. The absence of sensationalism kept the case present but quiet. In 2011, the State Bureau of Investigation conducted a cold case audit across several counties, reviewing files for procedural completeness. Emily Harper's case was flagged for additional analysis because of the preserved trace evidence and the clear timeline. Analysts recommended updated cellular mapping and a review of service road traffic patterns during late evening hours. The suggestion did not promise answers, but it offered direction. Cellular data from 2006 was limited, yet not useless. By 2014, improved modeling allowed technicians to narrow the range of Emily's final phone activity to a corridor spanning less than a mile. This refinement did not identify a suspect, but it reduced the landscape of uncertainty. Investigators overlaid the corridor with known routes used by shift workers, delivery drivers, and late-night commuters, identifying nodes where paths intersected. One such node was the warehouse cluster off the service road, an area lightly patrolled at night. Employment rosters from companies operating there were requested and reviewed. Turnover was high, records inconsistent, and subcontracting common. The process was slow, complicated by closures and mergers that obscured accountability. Still, names were added to spreadsheets, cross-referenced with addresses and prior contacts. The re-examination of overlooked reports became a priority. A single-page note from 2007 described a disabled pickup logged by a tow operator near the service road shortly after 10 p.m. The report included a name, Thomas Wade Collins, and a brief description of the vehicle. At the time, the information had not stood out. In retrospect, it aligned with early tips about a dark pickup. Collins's initial interview file was thin. He had stated he was working late, provided a time card, and cooperated without incident. The time card had been accepted at face value. Years later, investigators recognized the vulnerability of that verification. Employment records were requested again, revealing that the subcontractor's timekeeping system had been manual and inconsistently audited. The supervisor who signed off on the card had died in 2010. Background checks revealed Collins had moved frequently, often following short-term contracts. Minor offenses appeared in multiple jurisdictions, none violent enough to trigger alarm. Yet the pattern suggested instability. Investigators noted that mobility can complicate accountability without implying guilt. The focus remained on facts. In 2017, legal guidance was sought regarding DNA collection. Advances in testing meant that partial profiles could be meaningful when combined with corroborating evidence. A discarded item associated with Collins was obtained lawfully, and a profile was generated. When compared against the preserved fibers and biological traces from Emily's clothing, analysts identified consistencies that warranted further inquiry. The findings were careful, probabilistic, and documented with caveats. Search warrants executed in 2019 targeted locations associated with Collins during the relevant period. The recovery of a jacket matching the fiber profile provided a tangible link across time. Investigators documented chain of custody meticulously, anticipating scrutiny. Phone records placed Collins's device within the refined corridor during the critical window, a convergence that shifted the case's posture. Throughout this phase, investigators maintained contact with Emily's family, sharing progress without speculation. The approach balanced transparency with restraint. When an arrest was made, it followed internal review and prosecutorial agreement. The timing, in early December, underscored the long arc of the investigation and the persistence required to complete it. Court filings laid out the evidence in chronological order, emphasizing procedure over narrative. The plea that followed reflected an assessment of the record and the weight of corroboration. Sentencing concluded the legal process, but not the impact. The community absorbed the outcome quietly, mindful of the years past and the life lost. In the aftermath, departments reviewed the case internally, identifying lessons about verification and documentation. The files were archived with annotations, ensuring future readers would understand both what was known and when it became known. Each December thereafter, the case served as a reminder that resolution can arrive long after headlines fade, sustained by methodical work and the resolve to revisit the past with clearer tools. By the time the legal process moved toward conclusion, the investigators involved had changed, yet the methodology remained consistent. Case notes were reviewed line by line to ensure continuity, especially where long gaps might invite doubt. Supervisors emphasized that cold cases are judged not only by outcomes, but by whether each step withstands later scrutiny. In Emily Harper's case, the strength lay in accumulation rather than revelation. The prosecution prepared its case with a focus on verifiable facts. The timeline began with Emily's routine departure from work and ended with the recovery of her vehicle. Each minute was supported by records rather than recollection. Store surveillance timestamps, transaction receipts, and phone logs formed the backbone. The narrative avoided conjecture, presenting instead a sequence of movements that narrowed opportunity without dramatization. Expert witnesses were identified early. A forensic analyst explained the significance of fiber persistence, noting how synthetic blends can survive laundering and years of storage. Another specialist detailed the evolution of cellular analysis, clarifying why earlier mapping lacked precision and how later techniques improved reliability. The testimony was designed to educate rather than persuade, reinforcing credibility through clarity. Defense counsel examined the same materials, probing gaps created by time. Questions focused on evidence degradation, witness memory decay, and the initial acceptance of Collins's alibi. Prosecutors responded by demonstrating how each concern had been addressed procedurally. The presence of corroborating data reduced reliance on any single element. The case did not hinge on a confession or a solitary test result. The plea agreement emerged after weeks of negotiation. It reflected an assessment of risk and responsibility, acknowledging the evidentiary weight while sparing the family prolonged proceedings. When Thomas Wade Collins entered his plea, the courtroom was subdued. There were no statements beyond those required by law. The record captured the admission and the sentence, life with the possibility of parole after a lengthy minimum, consistent with state guidelines. Sentencing memoranda referenced the impact on Emily Harper's family without embellishment. They described years of uncertainty, the seasonal reminders of absence, and the quiet endurance that followed. The judge's remarks emphasized accountability and the role of evidence-based justice. The language avoided rhetoric, aligning with the tone that had characterized the case from the start. Media coverage of the resolution was measured. Headlines noted the arrest and plea, emphasizing the elapsed years and the investigative persistence. Articles summarized the evidence succinctly, avoiding speculation about motive. Editorials focused on the importance of preserving evidence and funding cold case units. The community response was reflective rather than reactive. For investigators, the case prompted internal reviews. Training sessions highlighted the necessity of verifying alibis independently, especially when documentation originates from informal systems. Agencies discussed the value of retaining evidence beyond minimum requirements and the benefits of periodic audits. Emily Harper's case became a reference point in these discussions, illustrating how early decisions can echo years later. The archives where the case files were stored reflected a physical history of the investigation. Paper reports from 2006 sat alongside digital printouts generated a decade later. Handwritten notes shared space with typed summaries. Each edition represented a moment when someone believed progress was possible. The final closure form did not erase the past entries. It simply marked the end of active pursuit. In the town where Emily lived, changes unfolded gradually. New businesses replaced old storefronts. Roads were widened, intersections redesigned. Yet certain landmarks remained, including the stretch of service road that had once been unremarkable. Drivers passed without awareness of its role in a long investigation. For those who knew, the knowledge was private. Emily's family chose remembrance over publicity. They established a small scholarship at the community college she attended, focused on students balancing work and study. The announcement was brief, circulated through local channels. It framed the future rather than revisiting the past. Each award cycle coincided with winter, a season that had shaped the family's memory. Law enforcement agencies continued to revisit unsolved cases with renewed attention. Advances in forensic science offered possibilities, but resources remained finite. Emily Harper's case underscored the importance of prioritization and the patience required to wait for technology to catch up with preserved evidence. It also demonstrated that resolution can occur without spectacle. The quiet aftermath extended beyond the courtroom. Collins was transferred to state custody, processed through intake, and entered the system without incident. His name appeared in databases, linked permanently to the case. There were no further public statements. The process followed established protocols, concluding a chapter that had remained open for more than a decade. As subsequent Decembers arrived, the case receded from public discussion. Yet within investigative circles, it persisted as an example of methodical persistence. The lessons drawn were practical: document thoroughly, revisit assumptions, and respect the evidentiary value of time. The story did not rely on coincidence or chance, but on the steady application of procedure. In reflecting on the case, investigators often noted what was absent. There were no dramatic breakthroughs, no last-minute confessions, no hidden witnesses. Progress came from re-examination and improved tools. The resolution affirmed a principle familiar to seasoned professionals, that the passage of years does not negate responsibility, and that careful work can restore order even after long silence. The final stage of the case unfolded without ceremony, reflecting the tone that had governed it from the beginning. Once sentencing concluded, administrative steps followed in sequence. Evidence logs were finalized, exhibits returned or retained according to statute, and notifications sent to agencies that had assisted across the years. The case status changed from open to closed, a small update in a database that carried significant weight for those who had worked it. For the investigators who remained, closure prompted reflection rather than relief. Many had inherited the case midway, learning its contours through reports and preserved materials rather than first-hand experience. They understood that responsibility in such investigations extends beyond resolution to stewardship of truth. Emily Harper's file illustrated how accuracy preserved early could enable justice much later. Training units incorporated the case into instructional materials. Emphasis was placed on the importance of skepticism toward early assumptions, especially those supported by informal documentation. The acceptance of a time card without corroboration became a focal teaching point. Instructors noted that procedural shortcuts, even when unintentional, can delay accountability. The lesson was framed not as criticism, but as guidance for future diligence. The courthouse where proceedings concluded returned to its routine rhythms. Dockets filled with new matters, jurors rotated, and holiday decorations were stored away. For clerks and staff, Emily's case became one among many resolved, yet its duration marked it as unusual. Files were boxed, labeled, and transferred to archives where controlled conditions preserved them for potential future reference. Local law enforcement maintained periodic contact with Emily's family after the case closed, a practice adopted to ensure transparency and support. Conversations were brief and respectful, acknowledging that legal resolution does not erase loss. The family expressed appreciation for the persistence shown over the years. There were no public events or statements, only private acknowledgement. The community absorbed the outcome gradually. Some residents remembered the initial reports from 2006, recalling where they had been when the news broke. Others learned of the resolution only through a short article tucked inside the local paper. The reaction lacked intensity, shaped by the long passage of time and the absence of ongoing fear. The arrest did not signal a current threat but closed a historical wound. Seasonal context remained significant. Each December brought familiar imagery: cool mornings, subdued traffic, storefront lights reflecting on wet pavement. For those aware of the case, the season carried layered meaning. It marked both the beginning and the end of a long investigation. The overlap of holidays and memory underscored how time had stretched between those points. Emily Harper's name persisted in official records with clarity restored. Where uncertainty once existed, there was now a documented sequence supported by evidence and legal judgment. The correction of the record mattered to investigators committed to accuracy. It ensured that future references would reflect established facts rather than speculation. Cold case units across the state continued to seek funding and support, often citing resolved cases as justification. Emily's investigation demonstrated the value of revisiting preserved evidence with new tools. Grant applications referenced advancements in fiber analysis and cellular mapping, linking technical progress to tangible outcomes. The argument was practical rather than emotional. Within professional circles, the case reinforced an understanding of investigative endurance. Detectives discussed how morale can wane when progress stalls, and how leadership must sustain focus without creating false urgency. Emily Harper's case showed that measured persistence, combined with periodic reassessment, can maintain momentum over years. The legal outcome carried implications beyond the sentence imposed. It affirmed standards for evidentiary linkage in long-delayed prosecutions. Courts examined the chain of custody, the evolution of forensic methods, and the transparency of documentation. The acceptance of these elements reinforced confidence in lawful procedure. As time moved forward, references to the case became less frequent. New challenges demanded attention, yet the file remained accessible, its contents unchanged. The integrity of the record was preserved as a matter of principle. Closure did not mean erasure. For Emily's family, the years following resolution settled into a quieter pattern. Milestones were marked privately. The scholarship established in her name continued, modest in scale but consistent in purpose. Each award cycle honored her commitment to education and work, reflecting a life defined by effort rather than its end. Law enforcement agencies conducted annual reviews of cold cases, updating lists and priorities. Emily Harper's case was no longer included, but its influence remained. Policies evolved incrementally, informed by experience rather than reaction. The emphasis stayed on methodical practice. The story concluded without dramatic finality. There was no public reckoning, no symbolic gesture. Instead, there was documentation completed, accountability established, and routines resumed. This understated ending aligned with the nature of the investigation itself. In considering the full arc of the case, investigators often noted the absence of chance discoveries. Progress came through deliberate review, lawful collection, and patience. The resolution did not rely on coincidence, but on the convergence of preserved evidence and improved analysis. The community moved on, carrying forward an understanding that justice can arrive quietly. The case demonstrated that resolution need not be loud to be meaningful. For those who value order and procedure, that understanding was sufficient. Emily Harper's case closed as it had unfolded, grounded in facts and process. The long interval between discovery and resolution did not diminish responsibility. Instead, it affirmed a commitment to pursue truth regardless of time. That commitment, sustained across seasons and years, defined the investigation's legacy and provided the only appropriate conclusion.